I need to get to the next piece. Susan, how do I get to the slides? Here we go. We'll get to the slides in a moment. There's a lot of folks, let me just introduce for a moment, there's a lot of folks in this room who have been thinking about this for a long time. And you're here because of that, and we'll repeat that as we go forward. And I deeply appreciate your willingness to come and be part of this exercise. One of the things that will be, so we are a select gathering. We've got many of the leading folks here. Most people in this room have a piece of the puzzle, at least a piece of the puzzle that you've got some solution to. That's why you're here. But we also recognize that that is going to be an impediment, and I'll get to that in a little bit, because this is a standard setting exercise, and all of us have to keep that in mind. We've attempted to have a wide range of the constituencies here. As you'll hear when we get more into standard setting processes, that's thought to be one of the keys. We'll hope to reach, and if we go forward with this initiative, to continue to broaden it. Today's program is meant to be a starting point, again, and it's not meant as an ending point. In the agenda, as Rebecca said, that basically we've got a kind of a what's the process piece. We've got Harry Surden's going to take us through a possible architecture and use that as a starting point for further discussion. Meng Wang is going to take us through a history lesson after lunch. It's fabulous. I've enjoyed it at any rate, and show, again, calling out a number of the people in this room about things that have occurred. Time for interaction and contribution. Rebecca is going to manage that. Those of you who are online, by the way, we're going to try and carve out a little time in the discussion periods at each point. She's going to say, and by the way, now is a time for the folks who are online. The folks who are online also just post. Brian is keeping track, and we'll get those in. Again, it's always hard to moderate between the room and online. This is our attempt to do that. All right, what is a legal specification protocol? That's at least the working name that we've chosen to use to talk about this. We've felt that as I think, I don't need to explain it to too much people in the room, that to make law machine computable, not just machine catalogable, not just machine findable, not just machine assemblable, all of those things which are out there, to really make it computable so that we can use the power of computing fully to describe and execute legal formulations. We need something that looks like a widely shared, capable legal specification protocol. I've used the metaphor that law is in the AOL dial-up phase. There are people who have this partially solved, or many of you in the room again. The problem is that it's, your AOL, you're in a silo, we haven't gotten something yet that is shared widely enough to be the web. So the Internet Protocol comes along and provides a communication and description set of conventions around which all kinds of other stuff can proliferate. And it's our feeling that the law would, this kind of vision of computable law would be well served by having something like that. A standard capable of supporting smart contracting, the focus that we're using as our focal point for the discussions at this point, and beyond. We've got fintech. Fintech's out there. It's happening, all that kind of thing. Again, it would be lovely if there was a way that they could reliably, one system of fintech could reliably talk to other things. Fintech and the blockchain. We've got blockchain interest and capability here in the room. Again, if that could talk back and forth, that would be terrific. RegTech. There's all kinds of platforms coming out of RegTech. Again, if we described regulation in through some kind of protocol that was widely shared, that would become much more powerful and easy to do. We've got GovTech. Again, a variation on RegTech, but the governmental services migrating into this, again, would benefit from this. There's all kinds of GovTech companies out there doing these things. They don't talk to each other. If we had a standard, they could. So I think there are very significant possible efficiency gains from this kind of a thing, as standard setting often makes possible. There is an extension of the rule of law. We can use the power of computing to help extend the rule of law, access to justice, etc. We're going to explore as we go on some of the other possibility of things we want to gain. We're using the word protocol rather than a language. I must admit, when I started this, I was talking about a legal specification language, and people who are better at computing than I said, no, that's not really what you're talking about. A protocol, at least as I'm understanding it, as part of this definitional piece, is some kind of shared standard for representing, processing, and communicating the information and logic of legal formulations and processes. Again, all of this is meant to be working definition, not final definition, but something along that line. And it should allow many implementations, but that can work with each other, e.g. the internet. You know, we've got all kinds of search, we've got all kinds of ways to have web browsers, we've got all kinds of things, but they work on top of a shared basic system. Not a language, but not a platform, etc., but the building blocks of those. And we'll build a more complete definition as we go forward. Harry's talk is going to be at least a portion of that, and again, hopefully we'll have lots of interaction as we go forward. Contracts. We've used contracts as kind of a starting point. There are some benefits to that. Contracts are a very important piece of the law. They're not trivial at all. They are typically of a tractable size. If I dove in and tried to do the Internal Revenue Code in this, and use that as our use case, that would be more difficult than using contracts. Contracts are typically a relatively contained space of specification. It's also a private field, and private actors can move typically more quickly than the government. My apologies to my colleagues from the former colleagues from the OFR and NIST. But again, it's an area in which the private actors can do this. There are fewer coordination problems, not none, but fewer coordination problems. Private field 2. The benefits give incentives, and indeed lining up incentives. Our activist friends, for instance, here, the financial world, I think you see that there are some incentives to the financial world for achieving something along this line. Many of us are already working on computable contracting. We've got computable contracting going forward. There's folks who've got some great standards and work already being done. We can build on that. But I'd like us to keep in mind the bigger project as we use this. So there are some here who are aimed more at that, and I'd like us to keep in mind and have both, in a sense, on the table, the computable contracting as the use case and the bigger project as well. Why not already? Why don't we have this already? As Rowan said, hey, we've been talking about this. The folks in this room have been doing this for a while. Meng is going to give us that history lesson later on. But input and data, for example, there's the Blue Book. Actually, the Blue Book is a standard for data specification and retrieval. For those of you who are lawyers and think about it, the Blue Book is the way that the conventions around which we list citations, and that is a natural language data retrieval standard. There's search approaches that are out there, legal and court XML, legal rule XML or ML. There are some wonderful things out there. FIBO and XBRL for finance. In programming approaches, there's the A to J author from Cali. Solidity from the blockchain world is out there and is quite a capable platform. Neota, Exari, e-government companies, workflow, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of people doing some of this. And my apologies to any not mentioned, particularly those who are in the room or online. Why not already? Well, I think that's because there's 3 layers of challenge at least. And there's the technological layer, and that's the one that we tend to jump to right away. And I've got what I call the hackathon fallacy, which is, hey, if we just got the technical people in this room together for a long weekend, right, building on the stuff that's already done, we'd have it solved. Not really. I mean, we'd have it semi-solved. Let me give this a short story about NASA and the moon. My understanding is that when NASA got started and got told we're going to go to the moon in the early 60s, they convened a working group around it, and they said, design how we're going to go to the moon, and they came up with what was effectively a kind of a modified airplane. And they looked at this thing and said, no, this isn't going to work. And so they redid it, and they said, instead of this kind of modified airplane, we need to think more broadly about this, and how are we going to do this? And one of the ways that they said is, okay, let's start from the back. You're on the moon. What do you need? And the first thing you needed was the mechanism to get back to the Earth. Because, you know, you want to get, so that was, and the second thing you needed was the stuff you were going to be on the moon with. And then the third thing that they needed to design was how to get all of those things to the moon. Okay, yeah, some of you shaking your head, you know some of this story. Again, there's this kind of thing that we have to actually take the time to envision what it is we need to do with this thing, rather than just put this, you know, all the smart people in the room here for the weekend and we'll come out and we'll have the answer. Because unless we really take the time to build a little bit backwards and frame it up and figure out what this thing really needs to do and how it needs to look, whatever we try and do is going to be insufficient. Secondly, anticipation and generativity. We can anticipate some of the things this needs to do in the future, but we also need a standard that's going to be designed so it's open to being able to do stuff we don't know about. The concept of generativity, Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard wrote a book about that on the internet. He said the internet succeeded because it was not bolted down. You know, there was a loose set of protocols around which we could build all kinds of stuff. The internet, some of you are aware of Minitel, the French kind of online service that went nowhere. The reason it went nowhere is that they designed it really beautifully for 1992, or whenever it was started. And hard designed it and hardwired it and did everything hard, and it was better than the internet for about 6 months, and then it was done. So whatever standard we are able to come up with, the law has to be able to build beyond that. And then the final and perhaps biggest problem is coordination and acceptance. The coordination is a problem. There's a joke I heard about many standards. You know, we've got 10 standards, says a bunch of people. We need something else, and they get together and have a process, and they come out, and then there's 11 standards, and now we got to, you know. So what we need to do is figure out a way to use interoperability, legacy friendliness, a bunch of things that will make it possible to have a standard that doesn't fully disrupt anything that's already going on, but actually creates bridges so that we can move forward in that kind of a way. So those are some of the problems. Process, work together to solve all these layers, openness to other solutions, keeping many goals in mind. Oh, and exercise. Everybody get a piece of paper and a pen. Get a piece of paper and a pen. Write down in one sentence your best idea for this. This is why you're all here, right? It's because you've got a really good ideas. Write down your best idea. Write down your best idea. Just take a minute. Whatever it may be. My best idea. My best idea is I think is something in the data standards area, but we'll see. Okay, has everybody got not quite yet? Just some representation of your best idea. Yeah, borrow a piece of paper. Okay, now turn to one of your neighbors and just read that best idea. Turn to one of your neighbors, just read that best idea. All right. It's a little hokey. I'm sorry. There we go. A little hokey. There we go. It's a hokey time in this thing. All right. Just to read your best idea. It's a good idea, right? Cool idea. There we go. Okay, everybody got that? Now take your piece of paper. Take your piece of paper with your best idea. Everybody. Okay. Take your piece of paper. Take your piece of paper. All right. Yeah. Whoa. Okay. Take your piece of paper. Crumple it. Crumple it. It's your best idea. Crumple it and put it on the floor. Okay? Because as this process goes forward, we're all going to have to do that. Now, take it back up, because that best idea is what we want you to share, but you need to be ready as this process goes forward to take that crumple and put it on the floor, because, you know, he's got a better idea. He's got better ideas. There we go. You know, I'm going to have to do that. So that's a piece of what we're about. Exercise, iterative, it'll keep patience and persistence and keeping an eye on things. The goal for the meeting, working approaches on substance, the technical topics, the important goals, etc. Also a working approach on the process. We're looking for both working approaches on that. We're not going to come out with a conclusion, we're going to come out with working approaches. There we go. That's an introduction to what we're up to here. I want to many thanks you've heard. I want to also thank our hosts, Roland and Susan, who has carried so much of the logistical and organizational weight. Planning participants, in addition, the LTL you've heard about. I also want to mention that the Grutter Institute hosted us for our sort of initial planning meeting at its annual meeting in May. Office of Financial Research, etc., and all in attendance. Thank you very much.
Next up is Mark Flood, who's the principal researcher. Did I get the title right? From the research principal. I knew I was going to mix it up, from the Office of Financial Research. And we've been asked to use the podium mic so that we're not giving too much feedback to the folks with headphones on.
Thank you, Rebecca. While we're getting the slides up, I'll just point out that we're going to get the two necktie guys out of the way first. Last year, in DC, where I'm from, it's sort of impossible to be overdressed. But I was at a MIT Media Lab last year, and Simon Johnson leaned over to me on the panel and said, you know, if you come into the media lab wearing a necktie, you're sending a very strong signal that you're completely clueless. But I don't care. All right, I'm going to talk about the forces and constraints around representing financial contracts. And I have to start with another DC thing. Disclaimer, views and opinions expressed are those of the speaker, do not necessarily represent official OFR or Treasury positions or policy. You're all lawyers here, so you understand. So Roland mentioned that he thought that maybe they were in the right place at the right time. I'm going to argue slightly differently. Roland, you simply existed at the right time. Has nothing to do with location. And so this is a fairly simple chart that the original version of this, Alan Mendelowitz and I had in a conference paper several years ago. But I think it illustrates the core problem very nicely here. So you've got 3 time series, go back to the early 70s. First one I want to focus on is, should be familiar to most of us, Moore's Law, number of transistors per chip. That's just fitting an exponential curve to transistor densities. And what that is reflecting is the growth in computational power, and that has important implications for finance. So partly what computational power does is it makes existing processes faster and easier, used properly. But there's supply and demand at work here for computation power. And one of the things that happened in our lifetimes in the financial world is in the mid-70s, Robert Merton at MIT produced a groundbreaking paper that allowed pricing of derivative securities. That's important because traders, if they can price something, will trade it. If they can't price it, they don't know how to sell it. But once you can price it and you can put a bid-ask spread around that price as your error tolerance, you can trade stuff. And it wasn't just the puts and call options that traded on the Chicago Options Exchange. These sorts of clauses started getting embedded in structured products of all sorts. And so a plethora of new contract types became possible. And to price these things, in many cases, required Monte Carlo analysis, which is very computation intensive. It's sort of a brute force probability analysis. So Moore's Law is there to tell us the growth in what's possible. It's sort of a lower bound, so it's the transistors per chip, not the total number of chips deployed. The next line, the yellow curve is, I was lazy. This is a proxy for overall transaction volume. This is just the S&P 500, one particularly important derivative contract. And you see that also has been growing at an exponential rate. And there's a little hiccup there in 2008 in Lehman. The growth trend drops back down, but it's also recovered and back on its way up. Again, that's a lower bound. This is just one particular contract type among many thousands of contract types in the financial system, but growing exponentially. Every time one of these things changes hands, that's a new contract. The last line on the bottom, the green line, is also growing exponentially, but you can't see it. because its growth rate is so much smaller relative to the others. That is global human population, which I'm going to treat as an upper bound on the number of lawyers. And this, I think, is the fundamental conundrum. This is why we're here, is that we have a fundamental big data problem in the legal space, just as we had it in the finance space and so many other domains. It's not going away. It's here. This problem will make itself known until it's solved. I guess the challenge for us is something that Bani Banerjee of Stanford laid out very succinctly, is you can't solve exponential problems with linear solutions. We can't just keep doing the same sort of lawyering and contracting we've been doing all along and try to do it faster. We can't keep up. That's not going to work. You've got to fight computation with computation. That's the gist of the exercise. Oliver asked me to talk a little bit about feasibility, so I'm selfishly going to toot our own horn. Oliver and I sketched out a possible approach. We think there's some interesting foundational pieces mixed in here. This is, you're not supposed to be able to read that. It's fine print. It's legalese. That is a loan agreement for your lawyers, but Oliver drafted it, so he's a lawyer. It's a proper loan agreement. It's like a real thing. If you signed it, you'd be contracted, obligated. And what we did was we actually extracted a representation of the obligations out of this into a discrete finite automaton. And you see the state transition graph there on the left. Just point out a couple of things here. First is the green path. We call that the happy path. Starts with contract signing at the top and proceeds through a couple of payment due dates, and everything concludes happily with termination at the bottom. In the finance space, that's sort of all we see. Right? You remember the Far Side cartoon, what the master says, what the dog hears. We have sort of legal blindness in the finance space, and the happy path is largely covered by the facts recorded on the term sheet. We assign probability distributions to those facts. We can do probability math, and we work with that. The stuff, all the other stuff, which is really interesting, those are things like default events. The lawyers worry about that. You know, we pay them good money to think through those and worry about the details. In finance, the way we deal with that is we say, build a large portfolio, and all that other stuff will just average out in the noise. Sorry. And that usually works, except when it doesn't. So in the subprime crisis, for example, we saw a lot of patterns, correlated defaults, that were supposed to average out and didn't. So when the averaging doesn't work, it's a big deal. One other thing to point out here is that I'm not sure how it happened, but the law has sort of iterated to a really useful design property, which is that we're able to capture the obligation contingencies here as a simple deterministic finite automaton. And what that means implicitly is that the state transition graph obeys the Myhill-Naroda property from computer science, or what we would call Markov property in probability theory, that the state that you're in at any particular point in the graph is independent of how you got there. Okay, so you don't need to worry about what was the path that brought you to the place you are in the relationship. You just need to know where you are. And that has enormous implications, simplifying implications for how to design these things. And I think that should be an important constraint going forward as well. Another thing that you get out of this is, this is the data representation. These are data tables from which we generated that picture. This is particularly interesting to me. These are the two different representations of the identical information. At the Office of Financial Research, we're interested in systemic financial risk patterns across the financial system, and having a database that would allow us to correlate contingencies across a wide range of contracts as data, searchable structured data, would be enormously powerful. Things like the correlated default contingency is something we could handle as a database lookup instead of an elaborate econometric analysis. Potential for huge payoff there. All right, can we do this going forward, right? That was a fairly simple example of a very simple contract. We're talking about a program for doing this on a much larger scale with broader scope, some feasibility factors. First is technological feasibility. And this, I think, is where the really interesting intellectual problems are, what make this interesting and challenging and fun for researchers. Balancing these two constraints, I think, is going to be particularly interesting. So can we design a representation that is simultaneously sufficiently expressive to capture all of the concepts that we need to capture? I can help with some of that, but mostly it's going to be up to the lawyers to pick that set. But at the same time, we want to make this sufficiently flexible, manageable, modular, that it doesn't run into the Minitel problem, right? That it can be used and evolved in practice. Economic feasibility, I think I tried to answer that already with the first chart, the time series plot. The cost-benefit analysis has to work. That one seems easy to me. Legal feasibility, I won't lecture a room full of lawyers on legal feasibility. The one risk I see there is somebody might try to introduce IP challenges, so that would be sort of a lose-lose outcome, but something to think about. Operational feasibility, which specific use cases do we want to address? And really, I think that's a question of which do we want to start with? How do we prioritize the use cases? Schedule feasibility. Fortunately, we don't have a hard deadline that we've got to meet. We don't have to beat the Russians to the moon or get this done by the end of the fiscal year. But the sooner we get started, the better. A couple things to watch out for. One is what I call the sorcerer's apprentice problem. As we make contracts computable, there's going to be a whole a set of communities that start to understand the law, or think they understand the law, who didn't understand it at all before, right? The lawyers have done a very good job of keeping us excluded, but once we start seeing it as code, stuff we can program, we might try to do that. Having script kiddies design your contracts could lead to some very ugly contracts, that's something to watch out for. Is Turing completeness of a document a feature or a bug? Reading in a recent issue of Communications of the ACM, an article on brute force proofs in mathematics. So it's becoming acceptable against the natural tendency of mathematicians that you can prove theorems by brute force. So set up the basic logical constraints. It's too much for a human to think through, but you can put a machine reasoner to work on it, let it run, and come back with a solution. It's possible to imagine contracts that are that elaborate. What do we do if you've got a contract that can only run through machine reasoning, and there's a dispute, and you've got to explain it to the judge? I don't know. And then lastly, provisioning a public good, having the boundary line between what's going to be an open public standard and what's going to be the proprietary implementations. Having good fences there will be, I think, incredibly useful. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So Oliver gets us the call of why we need to do this and what it might look like in a global sense. We hear about feasibility and risks from Mark. Next up is Mary Beth, who's going to talk a little bit about how we set standards around these sorts of things. Mary Beth is a standards specialist at the Office of Financial Research. Great. Thank you.
Okay, so this is, let me go back a slide. Again, the disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are mine and not necessarily representative of the official OFR or Treasury position or policy. As I was saying, can you hear me now? Okay. The world of standards is, actually, I consider it more of a universe. It's expanding, it's changing, it's very dynamic. And there are a lot of issues that come into play that we have to consider down the road. But for now, I think the thing to focus on are principles at a high level regarding standardization and a little bit of practice. Again, there are many ways that standards come into being. I'm going to give you an example that comes from one neighborhood of the universe. It's a very large neighborhood, but it is not the only neighborhood. So here we have a table of principles. The source of these principles come from the World Trade Organization. They have a document, Technical Barriers to Trade, and they were looking to reduce those technical barriers. They did not want standards being used as a means to create barriers. So they've identified about a dozen principles, which ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, has adopted and actually expanded on. And then for those of us in the federal government who work in standardization, we're guided by a policy from the Office of Management and Budget called Circular A119, which is federal participation in the use and development of voluntary consensus standards. And they identify key principles that they follow in federal policy. So transparency is one of the most important in this domain, especially when speaking of voluntary consensus standards. What that means is that records and processes are open and publicly available, that there are notifications of standards activities and allows opportunity to participate, and that meetings are open. Again, these are things that we need to be considering as we move forward in determining what standards approach is best for this area. Openness allows all interested parties to participate and no one is excluded. There's no unreasonable financial barrier to participation. Running a standards effort is expensive, it takes money, but we want to make sure that we're getting as many of the community of interest engaged as possible. Voting membership is not conditional or restricted to a particular type of participant, and then there's timely notification of initiation of standards actions. Impartiality is an important element. Effectiveness and relevance, this is something I think that is key, and Mark mentioned it. The standard that is developed, you want it to be used. You want the standard, the effort and expense put into developing the standard to reap significant returns on the investment that the community puts in. In order to do that, you have to keep it effective and relevant. Consensus. This is also a very important principle, where there's general agreement, but not necessarily unanimity. You want a significant majority to agree to a standard, and it's also important to maintain consensus throughout the development process, not just at the end, but at the end, final consensus is typically addressed through some balloting activity. Due process. Well, let me go to performance-based. Performance-based speaks specifically to the standard itself, where the other attributes speak specifically to the process of developing the standard. So when we develop a standard, we want to make it performance-based as opposed to design-based. That allows for innovation in terms of responding to the standard and meeting the requirements of the standard. If we're telling a vendor that it needs to be this wide and this deep and this long, we limit them as to how they can solve the problem. If we say, well, it needs to have a volume capacity constrained by those dimensions, but not necessarily exactly, then it gives them more flexibility to come up with a solution and to innovate. Coherence. The process, coherence avoids overlapping and conflicting standards, and this is where harmonization activities come in. What we find, especially in technology standards, is that some parts being addressed over here, some parts being addressed over there, and we want to maintain coherence, and that takes an active management process to do that. Due process. You want to be able to assure that all views are considered, and that if there's disagreement, that a documented appeals process is in place. That ensures fairness and equity. Any person may express a position and the basis for that position and have it duly considered. Technical assistance. The WTO looks to developed nations to assist less developed nations in terms of creating an environment which the standard can be used around the world. Flexible. This is an interesting one. The idea is not to prescribe an exact approach in terms of developing the standard, the process for developing it. It's to allow flexibility. We live in a world, as Moore's law indicates, where there's rapid technological change, and our standards development approaches need to be able to adapt. And there are certain ways that has been occurring, and it will continue to occur, particularly with the emergence of what are called consortium standards. And you see those emerging in areas where there is rapid technological change, particularly like cell phone technology and other types. Timely. We want to avoid having the standards development process bogged down by administrative items. We want to make it efficient and effective and get the standards out there in due time. Balanced. That's a big one. You want to make sure that there's a balance of interest represented in the development process, and that there's also a balance of influence, that no one party is unduly influencing the entire process and does not dominate it. So some dimensions of standardization include the community of interest, the form of the standard, the purpose, is there a geographic scope that we're interested in, and the level of obligation to use. So by community of interest, it can be small and narrow, focused on a company, or it could be a consortium of interested vendors and companies in general. It could be a specific industrial sector. It could be the government or intergovernmental sectors. It could go across sectors. And it seems to me that this particular legal specification protocol is the latter of those. So that's going to take a lot of consideration, and there's a lot of complexity in managing standards development across sectors. The form, well, this is a high-level idea of concept of form. standards can be documentary, which is what I believe we're looking at. It's a documentary type standard as opposed to a physical measurement standard. So we end up, we will end up producing documents, I would assume. What's the purpose of the standard? Typically, what you see happening is multiple volumes of a standard coming out. So you'll see one dealing with terminology, you'll see one dealing with representation, you'll see one dealing with various things regarding different aspects of the standard. Another one is testing. So conformity assessment is a complementary activities where we can assure that some product meets the requirements that the standard puts forth. Geographic scope. Are we looking at this domestically, internationally, regionally? I know Oliver had mentioned that we're looking at an international one, an international interest. And there are a variety of ways that we can approach that as we go through these efforts. The level of obligation, is it voluntary? Is it mandatory? Is it quasi-mandatory? So voluntary is you opt to participate, you opt to use. Mandatory are generally those that are regulated. They're put forth in government regulations. And then quasi-regulatory, one example of that would be where a government agency puts out a regulation and then they provide guidance to meet the requirements of the regulation. And that guidance may include various options for meeting it. The US standardization system, there is actually a US standard strategy from ANSI, and these are the characteristics of it, that it's led by private sector standards development organizations. It's a public-private partnership, so it does engage the private sector and government. It's voluntary, decentralized, market-driven, and sometimes competitive and duplicative. This differs significantly from what we see in standards development in other nations, where there tends to be a single standards organization that is in the government. So in the United States, we look to a cross-sectoral approach, public-private as well. And this is a reflection of our US culture, our traditions, and the dynamics of the public-private sector. It relies on the cooperation and communication among industry, academia, other stakeholders, government, and other private sector standards organizations. This is a very high-level illustration of a general standards development process. It looks very simple. The reality is it tends to be a lot more complex, and it's not quite so perfectly shaped. But the first step is that a standards need's been identified, it's been investigated and proposed. Then a subcommittee or a task group is formed, and they work through producing a draft of the standard. That standard is then released for comment and balloting. If all issues are resolved, it could be approved and published. And then over time, there's a maintenance element to standards. So you want to review it, and the subcommittee would then vote on whether or not to revise, reaffirm, or withdraw. And then the cycle starts all over again, depending on the outcome of that decision. And then here's an example of an approach to international standards. This is more from a traditional standards approach, where an international organization would be something like ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. What happens there is there are two levels. And there are then the international side on the left and the domestic side on the right. And the top two quadrants are responsible for voting, policy setting, and strategic management according to whether or not they're international or domestic. So internationally, you have technical committees. Nations participate in those technical committees, not individuals, but nations, not organizations, but nations. And from the US role is to represent a consolidated US position. There's a mirror committee called the US Technical Advisory Group, or the US TAG for short. Its participants are organizations, it can be companies, law firms, academics. Their role is to represent basically who employs them or their own position. And then come up with a consolidated US position to represent over to the International Technical Committee. Or at least it's to oversee it. The lower level, that's where the technical work gets done, the reviewing gets done, the actual standards development gets done. And those are done in working groups. The International Working Group consists of experts, and those experts represent their own expertise in the context of the US position. And then the Mirror Working Group, which is on the domestic side, consists of experts, again, whose role is to represent their expertise with the goal of coming up with the technical position that they want to bring over to the international group. So that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Woman with incredible patience. Thanks, Mary Beth. Yeah. Although Mary Beth was talking about standards, I want to just refer you to that conversation about principles and whether they be through a standard setting organization or through an independent organization. We're going to revisit that conversation in the afternoon session. So take another look at those slides and muse on that over lunch if you would. Final speaker for this morning, we're going to push the break back about 15 minutes since we had a little one anyway. Is that all right? We're going to push the break back a little bit. Harry has kindly conceded some of his time to give us a little logistical help here this morning. Our last person is Susan Sulkine, who is a fellow here at CodeX, and we also should thank for all of her work organizing this event, from the invitations to the rooms, to the food, to the AV, and everything else. This is really Susan's been doing all of the logistics. So Susan, thank you.
Thank or blame, I guess. All right, so someone had to have the unpretty eye chart slide, so it's me. Really, there's nothing mind-blowing about, sorry. Oh, yeah, and I'm sort of the AV support too, so. I just have two slides, and they're really just to make a point that's not really that mind-blowing, but it's just to kind of get us, I mean, we're rightfully focused on the technology and the standard setting exercise, critically important to our work here. But I also want to get us thinking too more broadly about some of these other factors and constraints, challenges, whatever, out there in the real world. And I think Mark helped really drill down really into the financial sort of very compelling use case and one reason why some of us or all of us may be here to address. But I sort of like to think about, this gets back to this, are we building an airplane or a rocket ship to get us back from the moon? I think one way to try to help make it a rocket ship, more to meeting our requirements, is to try to think about things like beginning with the end in mind. And a maturity continuum always helps me do that. We all have our favorite way of doing this, but this is just to illustrate a point. And the point of this slide, I guess, is to say, one nice thing about a maturity continuum, which we may be familiar with when you develop software, is, you think about the highest level maturity or the ideal state, and that gets you your vision, your big vision about where you want to be. And then you think about your current state, where we are, and some transitional states. And what I've done in that red is just kind of plug some thoughts in from Harry and Oliver's white papers with regard to this particular project. And it's just to kind of, Oliver tells us we're in the dial-up phase right now. What would full implementation look like? And this is just an exercise that, maybe we'll do in our groups, maybe we won't, but it kind of graphs out some key concepts about what would these states look like. And I think it's really important to build that rocket ship to really think about that end or highest level of maturity. So a lot has been written about this, so I'm not going to reinvent that, but also I've put question marks here because beyond just the technology, beyond the technology, we really need to think about the users and the the landscape from all different kinds of dimensions. And here are just a few. And of course, these can be mapped in various subdimensions, but I don't know, this may be one of the few slides today that try to deal with the bigger business picture, right? So this is just a reminder. Like I said, there's nothing really, new or novel or mind-blowing about it, but it's just to remind us to kind of tee us up for the afternoon. A lot of us have done a lot of work in these areas, and this kind of gets us thinking about, what would the world look like if we adopted, something along the lines of what our bigger visions are? And can we agree or come together on that bigger vision? Can we agree or come together on the challenge? And then maybe we can start to come together on what a solution may look like. But I think when we're all maybe fixated on maybe the solution or the right answer, we forget about some of these bigger picture landscape issues. So that's all that I wanted to accomplish with these two slides, is just kind of a reminder for our discussions this afternoon, maybe bringing, or hopefully bringing all the rich experience that you have about thinking about these issues and applying it to the exercises that we're going to be doing for the rest of the convening. So thank you.